Hi, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for August 26, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. We're joined online today by Jim Clausing. Jim, how's it going?
Going real well.
All right.
The weather's gotten a little better out here in my part of the country, so it's really nice.
Good. Glad to hear it. Summer's kind of winding down here as well. That's a calendar for you. So we're also joined on the couch by Manny Ortiz. Manny, how's it going?
Be back here.
Glad to have you, as always. And also by Joe Harten today. Joe?
Hi, Matt.
Hi. All right, and I'm Matt Kaiser. We'll go right into it with our first story. Jim, something funny is going on with Windows 10 and certain webcams. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Microsoft released what they called the anniversary update for Windows 10 on August 2nd. In older versions, this would have been a service pack, but they stopped calling them service packs sometime during the Windows 8 time frame. So now it's the anniversary update. And this was a big one. They introduced some new functionality. They upgraded some things. And in the process, they broke some things. There was a story in Ars Technica this past week highlighting one of the things that broke. One of the issues was, for some time now, Windows has had the ability to share the use of the microphone among different applications. Can all use the microphone at the same time. But it wasn't possible to share the cameras, the video inputs. So they developed this service level process that would actually directly interact with the hardware and then would share the video feeds among whatever processes wanted to use them. That's where the problems came in. There are a number of issues. For one thing, if you have USB webcams, they likely can't support high-def video unless you do some compression. The bandwidth of USB 2 is simply not adequate, but there are several different ways that the various manufacturers use for compressing the video. You can use H.264, which we've talked about a little bit on the show in the past. You can use MJPEG, but they compress things differently. So one of the decisions that Microsoft made in this Windows Camera Frame Server, which is the service that it connects directly to the hardware, is they would only take in uncompressed feeds from the camera, and then they would let the applications that were subscribing to the video feeds do the compression themselves. Well, that kind of breaks things. I mean, the idea was each application could do its own compression as it sees fit, but there are things like the example that the author gives here is Skype. If you've used Skype, you know that sometimes it starts out with the video not being the highest resolution, and as things settle down, then the resolution improves. Mm-hmm. Basically, it starts uncompressed, and then we'll do the compression to improve the video quality. As soon as it tries to switch to the compression to improve the video quality, it'll freeze up. And Microsoft is aware of the issue, but to fix it requires rewriting huge portions of this Windows Camera Frame Server code. So if you are running Windows 10 and you've all of a sudden noticed that you're having issues with your webcams, this could be part of the problem. Microsoft says there is a fix in the works, but not certain how soon that'll happen. And with Windows 10, Microsoft has made it a little harder to A, hold off on applying patches, or B, back them out. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that there's a whole lot you can do until Microsoft fixes this issue. But one of the other interesting points that was made in the article is they have the Windows Insider program, which is essentially where they beta test everything, all of their features. And what they've discovered is that their beta test audience is not broad enough to catch things like this. Folks who use their Windows systems for collecting their video surveillance feeds, or lots of use of webcams, apparently weren't participants, because it got all the way through the Microsoft Insider beta period without them detecting any of these issues. So, major updates, I always prefer to kind of hold off until everybody else has had time to find where the bugs are, but Microsoft is trying to make that more difficult. So,
well, I think that's the big downside to the new model of Windows 10, where, like you said, patches get applied. You don't always have the full idea of what exactly is going to change in the new update, and you don't have the ability to roll it back. And that was always something you could do. Especially, it's important for enterprise customers to be able to pick and choose, because they know their hardware. They have an idea of what they can afford to load in day one patches, if anything like that, and then maybe do some extended testing on a smaller subset of their machines, and then figure out, is this going to break things? Is this going to work the way it's supposed to work? It's that lack of transparency that I think is causing a lot of people a lot of heartache these days.
Yeah, but you weigh that with people choosing not to do security patches, and maybe this is a better model.
I'm not so sure about that. I know that there are certain categories back in the old model of, you could say, these are your security updates. These are your optional functionality updates.
Right.
These are your critical updates for whatever other reason, and this is your OS upgrade if you want it over here. Having those to choose from, I think, is great. I don't know that most people would voluntarily say, I don't want security updates over those, but if I don't want to install a particular driver for my tuned, high-performance video card, I think I should have that option.
Yeah, I
but
think
then
you'd probably get a lot of
breaking.
people who are just going to say, I'm not patching anything.
Well, this is also true. There are some people who don't want to have to worry about the maintenance of their own machine. And I would tell them to get a Mac. But that's not exactly true anymore either. So, but yeah.
Yeah, well, and for the enterprise customers, you do have the control to like the WSUS servers that you have now in the enterprise for Windows 7, Windows 8. Is still available for Windows 10 enterprise customers, so they can control. Hopefully, in enterprises, they are having some group beta test them before they roll them out to the enterprise. But so you do have that control in enterprise situations, but for the Windows 10 home version, you've lost some of the control that you used to have.
Yeah, that's really a shame.
For me, I guess the real surprising part was, I think, that last bit that Jim went over, which was that their insider program not having enough folks to actually catch this
sample set. Yeah.
Early on. To me, like Microsoft not having enough people in this type of group is surprising to me. That like this wouldn't have been caught early on, because I would think that almost any group that Microsoft creates like that would get enough following, and enough people, interacting with that particular group to actually pick up on this kind of stuff.
So I imagine the members of that group are typically enthusiasts, and some of them may have wacky hardware that they should bump up against and say,
exactly.
This one guy here reported. But I know it is interesting. It doesn't even. I think when I think of that sort of situation, I think of like oddballs. I think of like a weird piece of hardware that only like 100 people in the world have, like some sort of medical imaging device that might have been broken by a webcam thing. But it doesn't sound like that's the problem here.
Right.
It sounds like all models of webcams are being, or at least a significant large number of webcams are being affected by this. So I agree. It's weird that apparently nobody caught this before it went to production.
Yep.
All right, thanks a lot for that one, Jim. Let's go to you, Manny. It looks like our efforts at trying to educate people to be a little more aware and stop before they click may not be as effective as we think.
Yeah, so this particular story caught my eye just because of some of the statistics I'll go through, but I mean, in essence, this was a study that was done by a group in Brigham Young University in collaboration with some Chrome engineers. And their whole basically hypothesis is there a better time to display pop-ups? Which, immediately you're like, huh?
Well, when you say pop-ups, do you mean like security-related pop-ups? Or are we talking the stuff that when I go to a website,
So I think they tested the gamut. So, regular pop-ups, but in essence, security pop-ups are part of that same group.
Okay.
So anything that pops up that says, hey, maybe you should think twice about, about opening this, about clicking this, was part of this test as well. Right. So they basically went and tested, I guess they must have had a room full of people, writing emails and, surfing websites and, all the typical things that you would do on a computer, and then they would pop up messages and see, depending on the timing of that pop-up, whether or not folks would actually ignore it. Unfortunately, what they ended up finding was some of these statistics are quite alarming, but basically they said that 74% of people that were tested ignored the security message while closing a web page. Mm-hmm. So if you were in the process of closing a web page and you popped up something at the same time, more than 74% of them actually ignored the security message. 79% of the people ignored that same message while they were watching a video. So if you were watching a video and something pops up, you tend to...
Because you're trying to see that video.
Exactly. The cute cats that you're watching, following the laser light is much more important. And then the real alarming, the 90% one, the 87% of them ignored while transferring info. So like if they were receiving a confirmation code to log into something else, mm-hmm. if you popped it up at the same time as that, they also ignored. Which was interesting. Yeah. That one's very interesting. So the point is that obviously as a developer developing some sort of application or whatever, something that you're running on a computer, developers, I don't think typically, and I mean maybe I'm wrong here, but I think this clearly proves it, is that developers haven't really been thinking about the whole timing of displaying messages, whether they're error messages, security messages. So timing seems to be a big factor in getting folks to actually recognize and act upon something that you're trying to tell them that may be some sort of warning.
I'd be interested to hear from more developers myself. I know that when I write code, typically I'm not really concerned about when things occur. It's usually A occurs, then B occurs, and then C or D occurs based on the branch.
Right.
But
yeah.
It's not a question of when or how long do I wait or when's the most opportune time for the human brain.
Right.
It's always get it done next.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole art to the human factors element mm-hmm. of developing something that's going to be in front of a user. So, I think, not all developers are keenly aware, but, something like a browser definitely has that kind of, input into their timing of things. So,
yeah.
I'd also wonder if there's any investigation into the delivery mechanism of these warnings. I mean, is pop-up the best way to give somebody? I think as browser users, sometimes we're trained to ignore or trained to have the same reactions to pop-ups. If this is the same pop-up that you see 100 times because your certificate is old, sometimes you're just trained to just hit the little X in the corner and keep on about your business. So,
sure.
Yeah. If there's some way to, I think we've seen, there's the red address bar. I think that's a little more vivid for the user, but if we could look at other sort of human factors way of alerting people to security issues, that's probably something to look into.
So you're reminding me of, in Windows, typically, I think after XP, maybe Vista, whenever they started having a confirmation, are you sure you want to allow this app to run, or do you want this app to make these changes? The background grays out, right. Or gets dark, and then you get just that. It focuses your attention on that. That might be a better way of doing it in general.
Well, so I was thinking the exact same thing as you were thinking about, about graying out and basically making the pop-up the only thing that you see on your screen.
Yeah, that's how
but I believe, I'd have to go back and look, and I'm not sure if this went into enough detail to tell this, but I believe that some of the pop-ups that they probably presented were in that fashion. So like if you had a UAC pop-up that says
exactly.
basically like, hey, this needs whatever permissions, it grays everything else out. But I guarantee that some of this comes from folks that actually get that stuff grayed out and they still click the X in the corner because they're worried about what was happening in the background. You just interrupted what was happening in the background. They want to get back to it, so what they're going to do is just click the X and go past it. And I'm wondering if some of these statistics actually...
Well, with that, I mean, that's the same way that ads are now being placed
exactly what I was going to say,
on your browser. So, you know, you're sort of trained in this action to, you know, I see an ad, I close it. So if your security warning is delivered the same way your ad is, your brain's going to say, hit the X and close it.
Right.
So,
and there's not much you can do as soon as you start changing your model to be, this is what the visual language is for something that's important and requires action. Guarantee you, advertisers are going to say, people are being trained on this, we're going to make our ads look exactly like that.
Yeah. So. Or, you know what, advertisers will probably be ahead of the curve because there's money at stake for them, and the security, the mechanism for delivery on the security end probably doesn't have as much vested as, you know, the billion-dollar advertising firms that are, you know, have an interest in getting web ads out to everybody. So
it's a good point.
Yeah. So I think, you know, I think the key thing here is obviously, you know, those developers that are out there, you know, this may be something that you'd have to key into when you're developing a new program to you know, take some serious thought into when are you going to actually pop these things up. Maybe there's a better time to pop these things up, and you'll get a better response on those.
Sure, I think any human factors research like that is valuable, but I think it's valuable for both sides, both those who are trying to get your attention for legitimate purposes and those who are trying to sell you stuff or trick you into things. So, all right, the next one is Joe, and Joe, it looks like there's more maliciousness going around, still themed like Pokemon Go, which people are still playing. Yeah,
so I don't play Pokemon Go myself, but I've heard that a lot of people do. Actually, part of the stories I read in Data Breach today and another in Threatpost, Pokemon Go went over 100 million downloads recently. So it's definitely out there. Pokemon Go is augmented reality game is how they characterize it. And it came out about a month ago or sometime last month. We sort of looked at two different ways that malicious activity is coming out of Pokemon Go. First, there's been it's been used as a mechanism to distribute spam. So some fake spam sort of pot sites have been pushed out to Pokemon Go users. One Pokemon promo with some characters attached, and then another called Pokemon Generator. They're trying to get spam and referral chains set up through Pokemon Go users, solicit usernames and passwords, and offer Pokecoins as kind of the bait for people to, you know, fall for these fake URLs. And
well, let's be clear on this. This is not something being sent out from the Pokemon Go application.
No,
these are other people
it's
taking
targeted
advantage
at Pokemon Go users.
All right.
Thanks for pointing that out. So it's not part of the app, or it's not a fake app or anything. It's being targeted at Pokemon Go users.
Okay.
So then the other aspect is some ransomware that's come out. The malware hunter team group found two forms of ransomware targeted at Pokemon Go users. First, a variant of Detox Crypto. Basically, this ransomware takes a screenshot of your desktop, pretty standard ransomware stuff, and sends it to a controller so they can prove they have your stuff and, you know, blackmail. It's coming as a Windows executable with a Pokemon Go.exe string at the end. And then it also plays a WAV file, pok.wave, and it's looking for 2 to 3 Bitcoins or upwards of $1,700. Mm-hmm. So it's just, you know, it's not a whole lot different from other ransomware, but it's you know, got Pokemon characters in the screen, and it's kind of, you know, tailored for this trendy.
That's interesting.
That's a little expensive, though.
But that's funny, because when ransomware goes out of its way to theme itself like something, typically what we've seen is it's either, you know, very much hacker-esque, or it's something that looks like law enforcement or like NSA. There's all sorts of
to trick you
in saying that somebody, you know, in law enforcement has caught you doing something bad, and you therefore have to pay a fine to law enforcement. But I'm not sure how Pokemon Go is a good theme for ransomware. What is it going to tell you, that you've got to pay? I mean, how does?
That's fine. It's just probably just trying to be current.
Does Pikachu have your data? I mean, what? Okay, all right.
So then there's a second variant based on Hidden Tier, which Hidden Tier is an open source ransomware that was published out on GitHub. It's supposed to be educational, but I think we've seen it used more as by hackers than for educational purposes. So this variant, similar to Locky, it appends .locked to the files and uses AES encryption. The one nuance with this is that the lock screen on this one is in Arabic. So it's not certain if that's the language used by the developers of the ransomware or if it's targeted at Arabic users. So I think a lot of the pieces of this version seem to show that it's still in development. They put in an auto-run file on the drives, but it doesn't auto-execute, so you'd have to kind of get the auto-run file onto a CD or USB yourself. But I mean, it is fairly advanced. They put an admin level account named Hacker with a 3 on all the drives. So it's it's another new ransomware. It's probably I'm sure the Pokemon Go aspects of it will probably go away as it becomes less trendy, and we'll just see hidden tier versions out there. So
interesting.
But in general, ransomware, we still, there isn't a great way to get rid of ransomware. That you're better off trying to prevent it and have your systems secured and limited vulnerabilities. The guidance really still is not to pay the ransom and deal with backups and snapshots. So,
all right. I think it's still interesting, and I think this sort of idea was going on when I was a young gamer. Is that kids are always looking for ways to get a leg up in their game. If it's competitive, they're going to want to find ways to get more Poke coins than they're entitled to, or find more advantages that so they can beat their friends. And this preys on that sort of aspect of, hey, you're going to be able to get something for nothing, except you do get something, and it's a little more than nothing. It's a shame, I guess. To me, I think the idea of educating younger players of games to the fact that this stuff actually exists, that downloading this file on your computer is not going to give you more coins in the game. They should be looking out for these sorts of scams, because I think it's the younger, more naive players who are going to fall victim to this because they expect that they can cheat.
Or, if Pokemon Go is the kind of thing that's getting new users or people who aren't as familiar with computer systems using them, this might be some way to get at kind of naive users who all of a sudden, now I want to get on Pokemon Go. Now I'm going to start, getting into this world, and I'm not as capable, and I don't have a 20-year history with computers to understand what's safe and what's not safe.
Sure.
So,
yeah, I think originally we saw a lot of fake versions of the Pokemon Go app itself. When it had not been released worldwide. And it was the foreign players where it wasn't released yet who were motivated to try and get a working copy of it, and they fell victim to the same sort of thing.
Right.
It's a shame. All right, thanks a lot for that, Joe. Next one up is Jim. This is an interesting technique that we're seeing malware using virtual machines to hide its presence. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, this was an interesting blog post by the SecureWorks folks. Their researchers posted some findings of an investigation that they had observed. They were watching, I think it was an APT actor, as they were trying to access some Windows systems. And what they found was that this particular adversary had gotten into the system. They had escalated their privileges sufficiently that they were able to launch the management console. And from there, they launched the Hyper-V Manager, which is how Microsoft manages their own flavor of virtual machine infrastructure. They launched their own new virtual machine and did all of their malicious activity from inside that virtual machine. Apparently they had set up some channels so that they could get from the virtual machine to any critical data on the existing system, but they were attempting to hide their malicious activity inside of a virtual machine, which is, from the outside is pretty much a black box. They were kind of expecting that in this particular infrastructure, having virtual machines wouldn't be, in itself a red flag, wouldn't set off the alarms that, hey, this system normally doesn't run any virtual machines. All of a sudden it's got a virtual machine. because they just named the newly created VM new virtual machine. They had processes that were VM check and stuff like that. So they're kind of expecting that this is a system where having virtual machines running would not in and of itself raise the red flag. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. This is a technique that I've not seen the bad guys use before, spinning up their own VMs. Normally you expect them to pillage the machines they've compromised and then go out looking. Even the APT actors, they're looking for lateral movement to get to more interesting targets that have more data they can steal or whatever. Hiding their activity in a virtual machine is something new, but it's probably something that we're going to see more of. When you think about containerization and virtualization, being used all over the place anymore, I expect that the bad guys will try to do things like this. If not, a full-blown virtual machine, then something like a Docker container, because we're seeing Docker being used in production environments for encapsulating applications. It wouldn't surprise me to see the bad guys trying to take advantage of technologies like this to try to hide themselves in plain sight.
Yeah, and Jim, I mean, the fact also that I believe this also gives them a good opportunity if they do most of their work within the VM. When they're done and they destroy the VM, so does
no evidence.
So does all their evidence, right?
That's a good point.
So I think that's definitely one aspect.
They're only messing around in their virtual file system. They're not leaving artifacts in the file system of the host OS. Most of this stuff still will be visible in the unallocated space on the disk. Their virtual disks are created out of space from the host. So, talking as someone who does forensics on a daily basis,
right,
you'd have to make sure that you do a careful look at the unallocated space for those kinds of artifacts. You're absolutely right.
Jim, did they say what they put into that virtual machine? Did they just make some sort of Windows copy, or did they load in another operating system? I'm just curious what their techniques were once they had the VM and what they were using out, operating out of it.
In the blog post, I didn't see any details of what really went on inside the VM. I don't know if they did a more complete white paper technical report writing up all their findings. That was one thing that I was actually going to try to reach out to some of my contacts over at SecureWorks and see if I could get some more info on that.
All right.
One thing that I think I did read on there, though, was that because they stood up a full VM, that one of the things that they could do potentially is, instead of closing the VM down when they were done, they could actually leave the VM up as another way back in when they wanted to come in at a later time. So,
okay.
Basically remoting into the VM as opposed into the actual host.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right, and that would be one thing that would be, for the reasons you mentioned just a minute ago. If you remote into the VM, then you basically don't have to try to hide what you're doing, because the bad guys control the VM.
Yep.
So they can run their malicious tools without having to rename them or anything, because the system owner isn't going to be looking inside the VM. They're going to see the VM process running there. They may not have credentials to get into the VM.
Yep.
And to go what you were saying, Joe, I think you would be able to see this in network traffic. You would probably want to look for systems that had unexplained either server inbound connections, which I also don't know if this was a server within the environment or what, but a machine that the role doesn't seem to match up, or oddball traffic. But if these guys are APT, they're probably going to be using common ports, things that look like they belong there. You know, maybe the VM is doing outbound HTTP connections to some sort of hop point, and they meet in the middle and the traffic goes back and forth instead. It's all a possibility. But I think I will have to read this article. This was pretty cool. Thanks, Jim. So Manny, next up, I know we'll talk about the IoT here, but I think IOActive has found a spectacularly bad version of the Internet of Things devices that we talk about.
So as we always say, the IOIT, right, for insecure. This may, in fact, be the most insecure piece of hardware that has ever been put out on the market. Some guys over at IOActive Labs took a trip out to China and decided to bring back with him some toys to play with. This beautiful, and by the way, it is quite beautiful piece of hardware. You know, if you see the picture, I mean, it looks like something that Apple could have produced, and brought one of these back, which was the BHU router, and decided to see what he could do with it. You know, see what it's made out of. So obviously started to play around with it. He goes into, if you read the blog post, there's a lot of detail as to what he actually did. There's actually some really cool screenshots of him, actually taking the cover off, and you're able to see some of the ports that he was able to hook into. So he was using the Bus Pirate, which is an open source, like a multi-hacking tool.
Yeah, very cool little bit of hardware.
Yeah, so I've never played with one, but obviously you know what it is. And managed to get shell access onto the device. So the first couple of things that he goes through is the authentication onto the device. So immediately he was able to find 4 different ways that would grant him access to the admin account. So, not 1, not 2, not 3.
So did he find these because he had physical access to the device, or was he just poking around the web interface and stumbled across them?
Well, so I think it was a kind of a mixture. So he was able to get, once he actually had the device open, he was able to basically, I guess he was able to pull down, so when he rebooted the device, he basically got, obviously on his command line screen, he was able to get a login prompt, which gave him basically instructions on, and it was very easy. Very easy. I mean, it kind of just sort of laid out, like basically hit C for command line, which dropped him out to a command line, which started him up on, using a whole bunch of stuff, which he didn't have to use a lot of tips and tricks and hacking techniques to do this. A lot of the information that he needed was actually being presented to him as part of the, like the boot up. Like
a banner shows up and says, do this to get root access?
Now, he ended up finding a lot of other stuff by poking and prodding it, but there was a lot of stuff that was actually being presented that really shouldn't have been presented to him. So again, he goes through a couple of the authentication methods. So one of them being that there was a hard-coded session ID of 7 and 14 zeros. So that was basically hard-coded in. But the funny thing is that he also says that don't worry too much about that session ID, because if you misspell the SSID or drop one of the zeros, that's not a problem. We'll still let you in.
Well, that's the thing. Session IDs are not supposed to be static. That they're session IDs, I mean, they last for a session.
Right.
So these guys are they're already breaking the rules out of the gate and shooting themselves in the foot.
Like I said, it's hard coded, so you reboot the device, it's still there. The other one that he went into is if you forget to enter the SID, the router actually creates a random one and still allows you admin access. So that's the authentication piece. Now he moves into whenever the router itself gets rebooted, by default, and this is, you can't configure this, by default, the SSH gets opened up to the WAN side.
You said the WAN side.
On the WAN side, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that's, so every time it's rebooted,
so no matter what you do to modify the SSH config, it's going to do that.
So after a reboot, this device will show up on the internet.
Tell me it's got a default username and password. Yeah?
So I mean, it's basically the funny thing also. Well, it's not so funny, but it's. So yeah, it's a little bit funny. So during the reboot, the router also rewrites the previous password for this backdoor account, which is BHU root.
Oh.
So there's an account, BHU root, which is a backdoor, and every time, so even if you knew it existed
and you changed
the password to be security conscious, as soon as you rebooted the router, it actually resets the password for you. Let's see. I mean, this goes on, and by the way, that can't be disabled. So that user cannot be disabled. There's a hard-coded URL which allows access to one level above the admin user to give root access.
Okay.
And then here's the greatest part. So after all of this, I thought, wow, that's pretty bad, right? I mean, that's pretty bad. Can there possibly be anything worse than this? So he finds out that the router also has its own copy of Privoxy.
Oh, okay.
So it's actually running its own copy of Privoxy, which it's okay, except that it also has, what it does is it runs its own copy of this and appends some JavaScript to the end of every page that gets submitted through it.
That you visit as a user of the router.
Exactly. So and basically what it's doing is it's using it to actually inject ads.
Oh man. So it's not just that the designers were apparently negligent in building a decently secure router. They were actively malicious in tampering with your and putting their own ads into every page.
So make a little bit of extra money on top of charging folks.
I think you're right. I think this is a winner, Manny. This
Right?
is a hell of a.
So, Manny, do we think this is negligence or intentionally malicious?
It's
Could be both.
It's probably both. It's probably both. So you have to you wonder with that last thing whether or not the stuff before it was actually negligent or.
I know. I think it was. I don't know that. Maybe my mental model of this is wrong, but I think if someone designed this device, let's go back to the profit model here. They're trying to sell the device. They're trying to make a little more money on the side, so they're modifying the, putting in Privoxy and proxying all of your traffic for you without telling you they're doing it. If that was their objective all along, maybe they were just not paying attention to the things that they should have been doing, because they're not concerned about your privacy. They want your dollars.
Right.
I think it's wild.
That's a good theory.
But
I mean, like a hard-coded session ID, that's
a fundamental
crazy
misunderstanding of how web sessions work.
Just you wonder if the distributors of this router are intending for it to be, exploited and potentially involved in any of the exploit. I guess it's just.
Well, that's an interesting question, and if they were really that interested in getting it exploited, why wouldn't they go one step further and throw in their own botnet? I mean, maybe I'm saying too much here, but like, to me, it's. If you put these on the internet, they're gonna get botted,
right?
Inevitably,
definitely.
Right.
Jim, it sounded like you had something to say.
Yeah, well, and it's we don't know exactly what the motivation was of the folks who did it. So
Yeah.
We should say that up front. We're just kind of speculating here because
absolutely.
Is this some state actor trying to? No, why? Who knows? But
well,
so if you thought that this story was actually over, it's actually not.
Oh.
So the last little bit of this, which was great, is that they haven't had enough time to actually go into the kernel modules that are loaded, and they're believing, and I think their guess here is probably right, that there's probably more to actually report on once they've managed to get into those as well.
Wow. So custom kernel modules for the hardware that they're using.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I saw the.
So I guess we look forward to their next report then too, huh?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I was looking at the photos, and it looks like they actually built a circular circuit board to fit their circular case.
They sure did.
And most vendors that I've seen, you crack open their beautiful oblong, curvy hardware, and there's a rectangular board inside of there. They spent the time to make this a nice-looking piece of hardware on the inside, and then they did that.
Like,
so,
I would probably buy one of these just to hang on my wall. I wouldn't actually plug it in.
Okay.
But I'd hang it up on my wall.
Well, it sounds to me like all the stuff that they're doing on Reboot like if there's a way to modify that firmware, just take their firmware, modify it so all those, whatever they're doing on startup to configure it their crazy, crazy way, if you can just modify that and take it out, how much work is it going to be to turn this router with its flaws to something that's actually kind of usable?
Right.
I mean, I'm curious now. I'm going to see what the chipset is and see if OpenWord or somebody supports the chipset and be like, so this is a pretty sweet looking router. Right. It has its flaws, but it'll
right.
work. Maybe we can turn it into something nice. Anyway, I guess it's my turn. I always do a little bit of a Mr. Robot report, and this week we didn't have too much tech in Mr. Robot. We had a lot of interesting mind games and revelations. But the one tech point that I think we spoke about before is that, now this is going to be spoiler territory for anybody who's watching, is that the Midland City website, Elliot is being forced to work on it, and he goes ahead and he acts as if he's bringing it up, but what he's actually doing is he's exposing it outside of the dark web. And I'm going to say Tor in specific because we know from the previous episode that it was configured with Tor. And he's exposed it to the outside world, which means that it's open to scrutiny, it's open to law enforcement taking a look at it, it's open to search engines indexing it, and as a result of that, the feds come barging in and seize the server and seize everything and arrest, oh my gosh, I can't remember his name, Ray. They arrest Ray. But this all happens within the span of maybe 5 minutes, which is ridiculous. I mean, I understand you have an hour-long show, you can only fit so much in, but going from server hitting the internet to FBI at your door in 5 minutes is absolutely crazy.
They were probably driving by.
They just happened to be in the neighborhood with a SWAT team. And they're like, there's that guy. We should probably just say hi, see how he's doing, maybe bust him and arrest him.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I got a little bit of a laugh out of that.
Yeah.
There's a much bigger reveal that might explain some of that, and I am going to spoil it for everybody, but Elliot has not been at his mom's. Elliot has not been visiting Ray at his house. Elliot has been in prison the whole season.
Yeah, that was
that's kind of it's a big twist, and it also calls into question basically everything we know about what just happened for the whole season. So there may be explanations as to why Elliot's being allowed to use a computer in jail, or who are the people that he's been talking to and why they're all acting standoffish. And actually our producer made a really good point about the way they framed the shots where Elliot and somebody else is sitting at the opposite ends of a table talking to each other, and that's actually them talking through the glass during visiting hours, which is kind of cool. I think, in my opinion, the most interesting part of this season that hasn't really been explained yet is what Price and White Rose are actually talking about on the phone, because White Rose, who, if we've been paying attention, is actually somehow involved with Chinese state security, and Price, the head of E-Corp, have been having phone calls about some mysterious plan they're working on. I think it has something to do with eCoin, which is the evil corp version of Bitcoin, I think.
Okay.
And I don't know what it is yet, but it seems like they're playing each other against each other. Somehow, some other character in the show is involved as a figure, and they haven't said who, but they said it's a she. Darlene? Or, I don't know, Angela? So, anyway, I'm going to keep watching. I'm excited.
This is definitely one of those episodes that makes you want to go back
and rewatch everything.
Exactly.
Or just go to Reddit
because I'm sure
let somebody else
there is things that you'll now pick up on now that you know this little piece of information that will make other things sort of make sense. So
somebody on Reddit actually had a thread, like the very first episode, he wrote a synopsis of why he thinks Elliot's in prison. And I had read it, I'm like, that's silly. He's digging for stuff.
Right.
And you go back and read and go, you nailed it. So anyway, enough of my fanboy moments. Let's get back to the internet weather. And we have the top most probed ports, and there's no real surprises here. Folks, 23TCP is still at the top, and it's definitely Pac-Man shaped again. So we got Telnet, SSH, not a real surprise, 443. SSL 53 is UDP. There hasn't been that many changes in the ranking this past week. The biggest jump that we see here is 1900 UDP, which is SSDP. That's jumped up 12 spots, but we've seen it in the top 10 before. And it's still just boggles my mind how much traffic is being generated scanning on port 23. Here we see 30 days worth of scans for that port. And you can see that in the last week, we've almost hit the same kind of levels of the record-breaking amounts of traffic. And I'd say about the last week has seen a continuous ramp up of traffic. So we're in the middle of something big. This is maybe in my opinion, the biggest, what am I trying to say? Internet hygiene problem that we've got.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
a way to put it. Yeah. I mean, this is clearly botnet style traffic scanning in huge amounts, and I don't see it going away anytime soon unless we start getting some of these devices either taken off the network or cleaned up. Yeah. But I don't know how to achieve that. So we've also seen 53413, which is that netis backdoor we keep keeping an eye on. You can see there was a significant amount in the last 30 days towards the start of, maybe towards the end of July. It was huge. It's since tapered off, and I think it continues to follow that trend of slowly tapering off. Whether that means we've got all the infected devices infected at this point and there's no more need to scan, or there's simply no more interest in exploiting these boxes, it's not clear.
Or whether this is just a lull and it'll ramp back up in a couple of weeks.
That's also a possibility.
Or the manufacturer actually patched it.
Or the manufacturer patched. Now, I would love to know if that's true.
Right.
If anybody knows about that, absolutely. Yeah. That's interesting stuff. And another interesting one we've seen this week is port 60,001 TCP. I wasn't able to dig up too much about what's actually occurring on this port. There's some notes out there that it's related to a Microsoft Exchange address book RPC port, but I haven't heard of any vulnerabilities related to this or why people might be interested in this port. There may be another undocumented use of this port out there, always a possibility.
Maybe it's the BHU router.
Now, there's a question. People read well, that's the thing. You do see a significant spike, even bigger than this week's bumps, at the start of, I'm going to say the end of July again. And that was somewhere in the range of 2.8 million, I want to say, scan probes for that time period. So somebody knew about that, was very curious about it. Now we see a smaller bump. Yeah, I don't know what to call it, but I am interested. Again, top 10 most sources probing, that 23 is still Pac-Man shaped, and we don't see that much change in the ranking for this week. The biggest jumps were port 22 TCP, which is SSH, is actually down at number 7, which I would not have expected. That's still a pretty high value port. And then 4028, which we saw, I believe, last week, is down 3 as well. Usual suspects, 53413, 445, port 80, 6881, TCP and UDP, I think we said last week, are probably related to BitTorrent. And that's most everything. So that's the show for today. Thank you for joining us. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at attThreatTraq@list.att.com. You can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel, on YouTube, and an audio version on iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATTBusiness. I'd like to thank Jim Clausing online. Thanks for joining us, Jim. I'd like to thank Manny Ortiz for joining us again. Thanks, Manny.
Pleasure.
And Joe, also. Thank you.
Anytime.
I'm Matt Kaiser. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, keep your network safe.